Hello everyone, my name is Rochelle Innocent and I'm the founder and CEO of Project Purpose. Welcome to our channel. Our community is focused on fostering the intellectual and character development in children. We do this through our parent-child workshops that are focused on 4 themes: autonomy, self-efficacy, compassion, and self-concept, in order to cultivate grit, perseverance, and resilience in each child. At Project Purpose, our overarching mandate is to renew and rebuild family, community, and relationships. Our different social media platforms provide us with an opportunity to have discussions on all topics that relate to family, community, and relationships with ourselves as well as with others, with a primary focus on mental health and education. More precisely, the ways that the institutions of mental health and education play a role and have played a role in our societies at large. These discussions and debates provide us with an opportunity to think critically about what needs to change within these structures for us to live up to our bold slogan: support, protect, and empower each child through youth-focused development, better known as leadership in juvenescence. We recognize that in valuing our children's leadership potential, this also translates as recreating and co-creating environments, both socially and politically, that will enable our children to thrive. For those of you who are particularly keen on the topic, we also write thought pieces every other Sunday, and we have one scheduled to drop this upcoming Sunday. So definitely be sure to meander over to the website and check out our online content. For those of you who are looking for a listening alternative, well, we're available on 10 different podcast platforms for your listening leisure, and we've provided you with access to the links in the description down below. Now, as is the convention, be sure to subscribe, hit that post notification bell so that you are aware of every time we post. And of course, if you like our conversations and you want to keep them going, like, comment, and share this segment. Let's get into it. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and for those of you who are new, we cover topics that relate to mental health, mental wellness, and education, and today our topic of discussion is education. We're going to be doing a bit of a series on things to think critically about and what areas within our lives we need to learn to cultivate multi-perspectives on. So developing plural perspectives on specific areas in our life that are subject to change. So areas in our life that aren't just known, but the knowing in and of itself involves a lot of fluidity, right? That knowledge isn't static, it's dynamic, it's constantly shifting and changing and evolving with its interactions with the environment. And I'm here to talk about the 3 key areas that require us to think critically about. And I'm also here to provide you with my own personal paradigm on how to think critically about these specific key areas. And I think that it's very important when we think about education. Learning about ourselves is something that we need to carve time and attention to do. And sometimes we take who we are for granted until we are asked the question, well, who are you? And we start spitting off different things that we're doing, different activities that we partake in order to try to build into this definition of self. And all of that just really means that we're not necessarily taking the time that we need to think about self and how it's evolved and how it translates differently in the different situations, settings, and relationships that we are engaged in. So I'm here to talk about the areas where we need to think critically about, especially as it relates to ourselves, areas that I recognize it's super important to develop plural perspectives on, and areas where it's important that we think critically about it. We don't assume a simple, straightforward definition, and let's just jump right into it. So the first area that we need to think critically about is on ourselves. It's very important that we recognize that who we are as beings, as individuals, is complex, it's multi-layered, it's multifaceted, and all the while society will do its best to convince you that all of who you are and what you bring to the table can be fit neatly into a little cube. I'm guaranteeing you that that is not the case. And in fact, for those of you who have learned to conform to the cube or to the placeholder or to the area that society has deemed as the best fit for you, there's so much of yourself that you're ignoring, or so much of yourself that you're suppressing in order to fit in that little box. And I'm here to say it's so important that we develop a critical lens on ourselves, that we learn to look inwards and we learn to self-identify with all of the different shifts and changes that are taking place within ourselves without the constraint of external validation, without the constraint of external expectation, and also without the constraint of our own biases about the different parts of ourselves that we would rather stay hidden, but probably shouldn't be. identity, because I mean, they're who we are. So when I think about self, the areas that I like to reflect on are what feeds into my sense of identity. And a lot of what feeds into our sense of identity shifts and changes with the milestones and with different areas and levels of maturation. So I can tell you that growing up as a child, what fed into my identity quite a bit were the things that I loved, and the things that I loved became an extension of my idea of self. And then as I grew up, it was the things that would take up the most of my time. So where I took up the most of my time, that would definitely feed into my sense of self, feed into my self-perception. And as I'm getting older, it's really the endeavors that I'm engaged in. It's my visions, it's my goals, it's the pursuit of those goals that really feed into my sense of self. So not necessarily activities, hobbies, not necessarily social settings. It's really what I feel I'm putting so much of my energy into. It's becoming sort of an external projection of myself. So my sense of identity is very much sort of laid out in the areas where my energy goes into. But it's important to take the time to think about what's feeding into your sense of identity and what is shifting and changing by way of what feeds into our sense of identity, because it's not always the same thing. Also, when it comes to identifying my sense of self, I like to think about what satisfies my curiosity. And I think that what satisfies or what piques my curiosity has shifted and changed over time. And I like to think about what is fueling my curiosity in this moment, because the more often we take a pause and we reflect on it, we recognize that our sense of curiosity, our attention, it goes in different places depending, again, on the stages and phases that we are in life. So it's important to think critically about it, because our curiosity will give us a sense as to where we are in our life path, what it is that we need to do on our life path, what it is that we need to focus on by way of development as well. And this leads me to my third point when it comes to self, and that's thinking very critically about how it is that we channel our energy into our growth, and our growth within the arenas of intellectual growth, social growth, and aesthetic growth. So I think that when formal education is done, it doesn't mean that we're done learning and growing. We're not fully cultivated as beings. I think that that becomes the opportunity where we are the ones who take ownership of our growth and development intellectually, our growth and development socially. We learn to take on multiple perspectives and aesthetically. And I love aesthetic because I think the concept of beauty can be so simplified and diluted if we just take on a socially constricted construct of beauty. We can construct these things in and of itself. We can construct these things on our own. We can have a very personal definition of these things. And I think this also translates, like when I think about self, when I think about who I am, I don't necessarily like to think within the constraints of, gender norms, or think within the constraints of societal norms by how I show up in specific spaces, or how I identify to be much deeper than what it is that you can see. And I like to vocalize the things about myself that are beyond skin deep, because I would like to think that who I am is much more than what you can get at a surface level. So that's the first area, self, and I think that that was fairly in-depth. Now, the second area that I do believe we need to cultivate a critical lens on, so I'll cultivate also plural, multiple perspectives, is our connections and the evolution of our connections. And I think this is really important because there's a period of time in our lives where who we were connected to was dictated by people, above us, who had authority over us, who were taking care of us, and we didn't really have a whole heck of a lot of a say. But as we get older, we have more of a say. And when it is the case that we have more flexibility, more room for making our own decisions by way of who we spend our time with, we need to be much more deliberate and much more intentional about who is taking up our time and why. And I think this is very important to develop multiple perspectives on. And also it's important to be mindful of the pitfalls that we fall into when it comes to who we spend time with. And I think one of the biggest pitfalls by ways of our connections and why our connections fail to evolve is because of time. And we often think that because we've spent so much time cultivating certain relationships, that is the justification for continuing those relationships, even if those relationships might be toxic or hindering our growth or hindering the evolution that we would like to take on as people or as individuals. So I think it's important to think about the connections that you hold dear to you, to think about the why behind the connections that you hold dear to you. And again, if these connections have certain areas that, of concern, certain areas of concern, there's certain aspects of that relationship that are not necessarily healthy, you need to think about why it is that you sustain that relationship. And again, when we think about time and familiarity, these are often pitfalls that we fall into for maintaining and sustaining relationships that maybe we've outgrown. And when we think about making room for new relationships, you want to think about the relationships that will propel us, challenge our perspectives, challenge our points of view on things, give us alternate points of view, not always just acquiesce to everything that we say. We want to think about what kinds of connections, what kinds of people will stimulate me, will push me, we can have thoughtful conversations, we can go deep. Are those the kind of connections or relationships that I want? What kind of relationships are going to propel me in my life, in my career, all the other areas that I show up? I think that that's very important, and it's an intellectual exercise. It's something that we need to think critically about, and often an area that we fail to be intentional about, and then that translates in our day-to-day, in our lives, and in some cases to feeling stuck because we just haven't carved the time to put definitions and put words in place to give ourselves a sense of how we're navigating our ship in the arena of our social connections. And lastly, but definitely not least, and especially not lastly like a comprehensive sense, just lastly by way of what we're talking about in this specific video, by way of the critical lens that we want to cultivate. And when I say critical lens, it's also cultivating like multiple perspectives, is when it comes to our goals and our achievements. And these are goals that we have achieved, goals that we're hoping to achieve, achievements that we're pushing towards. And we want to also think critically about the goals that we decide are going to take up our time and energy. And why this is important, because it's important to recognize for the goals that we put in place for ourselves, like what are they building towards? And I think sometimes we put goals in place just, ad hoc, like we don't really have a rationale or reason for why. But because goals can be a fairly significant investment in our time, we want to know the why behind the goals that we put in place. We want to have a sense of direction, a sense of vision, and by way of how it is that we see that goal accomplished, the amount of time and energy we are willing to invest in making that goal become a reality. In other ways, sweat equity. And I love to think about my goals and the sweat equity that I recognize is going to be required in order for those goals to translate. And I think sometimes we get surprised. And in some cases, it's going to be a surprise because the goal is so far beyond our norm that we're not really going to have a real sense of the sweat equity involved in attaining it. But we can always put ourselves in a position where we're prepared, where we're at least mentally prepared that there is going to be significant, or at least a moderate amount of sweat equity in place. And lastly, when it comes to our goals, and the area that we fail to think of so much is what are you willing to lose for the things that you're hoping to gain? And I think that this is an exchange that not many of us recognize is in place when it comes to achieving goals that are going to stretch you beyond your comfort zone. When you stretch beyond your comfort zone, the things in your life that are comfortable are subject to shift and change. So take a look around you, think about the goals that you have in mind, and recognize that there are going to be some things that you did not foresee that are going to disappear, that are going to be removed from your life as a result of you pursuing these specific goals. There's a certain level of sacrifice, of loss that is a prerequisite or that is necessary when it comes to striving to achieving the things that really do mean a lot to you. So I thought that it was important to give you a bit of a paradigm. I'll give you my paradigm by way of how I reflect and introspect myself on the areas that I believe require a critical lens when it comes to who we are and the evolution of our beings on this earth as individuals on this earth. And also a lot of what feels like my personal paradigms of the questions that I ask to myself when I'm doing this thought exploration is really based on a dying literary genre, which is personal essays. So I love literary arts. I love reading personal essays, especially from centuries and ages past, because it gives you a sense as to the different ways of looking inwards that other people have garnished throughout different societies, different cultures, different lifestyles, different lifetimes. And I think that that is just so beautiful to be able to borrow some of those reflections and apply them to my own life in this present state. So I definitely love personal essays as a literary genre. It's definitely what has contributed to the fact that I have a blog space, and the style of blogging that I do is definitely an iteration of the personal essay. It is reflections and inner dialogue that takes place. And I love that kind of prose. I love reading that kind of prose. I love getting insight into the mental chatter of others. So it gives me an opportunity to give you some insight into the mental chatter that goes on in here. In any case, that was it for today. Now, before letting you go, I would be remiss if I didn't let you know that we will be going live at least twice a month, every month for the foreseeable future on our Facebook page. So definitely be sure to join in on those events. Now, they are paid events, though if you do see yourself participating in our community on an ongoing basis, then I suggest you take on one of our package plans. Yes, so we do have package plans plans that we offer that give you unlimited access to our live events, as well as access to workshops and webinars that we offer over and above those live events, largely focused on self-mastery. If you're worried about the cost, no worries. We have just implemented a new payment solution, Afterpay, that gives you an opportunity to pay in installments over a period of 6 weeks. So you don't need to pay it all upfront, all at once. You can parcel those payments out as is the best for you. So definitely be sure to check us out, check out our community, join our community, follow us on all our social media channels, and help us to grow. I'm so excited for the evolution of our community, and I look forward to chatting with all of you very soon. We'll talk to you later.
I just feel like no one's listening.